Welcome back to my channel for another Sony episode, and just recently I posted the longest video I ever produced for YouTube on more than 100 tips, tricks, settings and things you can tweak and change in the menu of this brand new Sony A7R V. And some questions I got concerned the multi-shot option. And on previous Sony Alpha cameras the multi-shot option was not working very well. On this camera it's different. In my experience, I've shot now many frames with this camera. In more than 90% of the cases you will be fine. But what to do if you had the multi-shot series of your life and at the very end the stacking doesn't work? In Sony's Imaging Edge, which is the software which is used to compile these 16 frames, for instance, on top of each other and create that super resolution in one single frame. In this video I will show both examples where the multi-shot option worked flawlessly and actually produced a terrific high resolution image, and also a case where the single frames, 16 frames coming out from the multi-shot procedure, are all fine, super sharp and crisp, but Sony's Imaging Edge just refused to compile these together in a way that the end result was not blurry. And then of course I will provide here in this video a workaround how you can stack together 16 frames by yourself in Photoshop and create sometimes a much better image than what you get when using the Sony software. At the end of this video you will have learned the best and optimal workflow for processing and mastering multi-shot sequences coming from the Sony A7R V. Of course you can also apply the techniques in Photoshop I'm going to show to other Sony Alpha cameras, and most importantly you will also see a couple of stunning super high resolution images which again show what this new Sony A7R V is capable of. Let's kick off the video. The multi-shot option here on the Sony A7R V is in the camera section, that's the main section. In the subsection it's under drive mode, and then you find it just here. And you can turn it on or you can turn it off, and there are also a couple of parameters you can tweak here. I use this function so often, that's why I'm also able to share experience here in this video about that feature, that I have it in my favorites menu here, or my menu, under menu and page number 3, and then I have it just here available at all times, and that is convenient for me. I've also placed it here on the function menu, so if I push the FN button you see here the last entry is actually the pixel shift multi-shot option, so I have always access to this function because I use it very often, because I like high resolution prints and my clients actually want high resolution prints because they want to print in large dimensions. The Sony A7R V has, like many other Sony Alpha 7 cameras, in-body image stabilization, and the underlying technique in a nutshell is that the sensor of the camera is floating freely in a magnetic field, and in that magnetic field it can actually be corrected for tiny little shakes and vibrations you might introduce to the camera by handhold shooting. And the same mechanism also works for pixel shift multi-shot. When the sensor is just shifted by one pixel in different directions, the camera takes automatically 16 frames, and later in post-processing you can stack them together with Sony's Imaging Edge software. I will now deep dive into examples of multi-shootings based on pixel shift, and I was taking images in 2 locations with this camera for the examples you're going to see. One is Zurich and one is Singapore, the Marina Bay in particular, which is one of the most famous hotels in the world. And I will show a little clip showing these 2 shooting locations, the environments, so you get familiar with what I'm shooting here. And then I will go in detail into the workflow, how to process these frames, what to do if you get stuck, if problems occur, and will provide tips and tricks so that you get the best out of the pixel shift multi-shot feature on the Sony A7R V and also various other Sony Alpha 7 cameras. So here in Lightroom we see first of all the single shot from the scene. Looks really good, post-processed already, very nice lights here in the evening and a very nice scene based on the long exposure, 15 seconds. River Limmat is very calm here and peaceful, so that looks all fine, and that's the 60-61 megapixel shot we get out of the camera if we go for single shot mode. Let's go back to the library, and the next frame here is the first of 16 frames which came out from the Pixel Shift Multishot on the Sony A7R V. And I have two things I need to explain here. First of all, when I started the sequence, it was later in the blue hour, and since I was shooting 16 frames and each frame had a 15-second exposure plus 15 seconds noise reduction by dark frame subtraction, that's a substantial time window if you add this all up. And it was getting very quickly darker and darker so that the exposure faded out, and I had to correct this in post if you look at the sequence of images here. And you see this best in the second frame. If you go into that and go into develop and before and after, you see on the left hand side the frame as it came out of camera is substantially darker than what I achieved later in post-processing in Lightroom here. So I had to correct for that. And the second remark I want to make, going back to the library here, is the following. I made a mistake because when you shoot a sequence of frames, also in time-lapse, you should never put the camera in auto white balance. But I overlooked it and it was in auto white balance. And somehow the camera during the multi-shot figured out slightly different settings on white balance, and I tried to correct them as good as possible in post here. Here's an important remark. I like to do my post-processing either in Capture One, and I use this mainly for Phase 1 and Fuji GFX images, or I like to do it in Lightroom. And here I've chosen for Lightroom, but the problem is the JPEGs or the digital negatives I can export out of Lightroom, they cannot be processed by the Sony native software to get the composition of multi-shots done. And that of course is a problem. So I had to rely on the original RAW files from Sony, but I don't like to post-process them in the Sony software because that software is super slow and also has not the features I typically have available in Capture One or in Lightroom. Since I cannot process anything that comes out from the export function in Lightroom in Imaging Edge from Sony, I have no other choice than going for the original RAW files, and I did here apply some basic post-processing, but a lot of features which you have in Capture One or in Lightroom are missing in Imaging Edge. And by the way, the software, as mentioned already, is super slow. So for instance, one feature which is really bad in the Sony software is the edit function. If we go here into edit and we go to exposure or brightness, you see you can only here adjust by 2 full stops. And in Lightroom, of course, you have 5 stops up and down in the same way as you have much more flex in Capture One. So that's really the reason, and besides many other things I could mention here, why Sony's Imaging Edge is not what I'm using typically. But if you want to do a composition of multi-shot frames, you need to go for Imaging Edge because there is no other option besides the one I'm going to show you in the course of the video, which is a way of superior way of processing your multi-shots. So let's get the composition of these 16 frames into one super high resolution image done. And the good thing about Imaging Edge from Sony is that it indicates here with a multi-shot icon and the frame number that this is frame number 1 out of 16 from a multi-shot series. Here we have frame number 2, frame number 3, and so on. The light will fade out a little bit as you saw it before in Lightroom because of that long sequence shooting time which I had for the 16 frames, and I could not correct this here in the way I wanted because, as I just showed before, I have only 2 stops for exposure correction up and down, and that's not enough for the loss of light I had during the shooting sequence. But we can now go and right click on one of these images and say create pixel shift multi-shooting composite image. And if we do that, first of all, I want to have here apply the selected image processing settings to each RAW file. And when I corrected these 16 frames, I went up on each frame on the exposure by 1.5 stops. So if I choose that, I have to choose the Zurich XML file which Imaging Edge created for me when I did the post-processing, and I open it. And then it gives me here an overview of everything I adjusted. So here you see plus 1.5 EVs and so on. So we choose that. We also choose here stabilize a composite image if it contains a moving subject. And then let's go for save, and that kicks off the process. And you will now get here a progress bar, and when the processing is done, we have a super high resolution image where all these 16 frames are stacked together. Here we are almost done, and if the process is completed, you will get a message and then it says completed, all processing completed. I'm now back in Lightroom, and on the left hand side you find the single shot I showed before, a super crisp, very nicely colored image with 61 megapixel natively coming out of the camera in the single shot mode. And on the right hand side you see the result from the multi-shot procedure we just went through, but I applied the same post-processing settings as I applied before on the left hand side, nor also to the multi-shot on the right hand side. The problem I have with the outcome from the multi-shot procedure in Imaging Edge is that it is not really sharp. Let's go here to 100%, and it's okay-ish if you look into that, but it has not that last level of sharpness I'm expecting from an image with that high resolution. So here it's a tiny little bit fuzzy if you go into the details here, and it doesn't look to me like a really good result. Also here, if you look at that sign here on that little white house, it's just not what I'm used to when it comes to sharpness and crispiness of an image. In contrast to that, on the left hand side, the single shot, this is really super sharp. Let's go here to 200%. Let's have a look. This is about it, about 200% here. Is much sharper, looks much better than what we have in the multi-shot result here. Look at these two comparisons here. On the housing side here, the multi-shot is just nothing to write home about. And what I'm going to do now is I will show you a superior way of stacking together these 16 frames with a much better outcome than what you get from Imaging Edge from Sony. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select these 16 frames. I will export them with the settings in post-processing into a dedicated folder, and then I will show you very quickly in Photoshop how you can actually compose and stack these 16 frames into an image with the same resolution as the Sony Multishot, but with a much better look, much sharper, much crisper. And by the way, with the flex that you can before adjust here in Lightroom, or if you want so in Capture One, all of the settings you want to have in post-processing and don't have to even bother about Imaging Edge from Sony. Stacking these 16 frames in Photoshop requires 5 steps. Step number 1 is loading all 16 frames into a stack, which creates 16 layers in Photoshop. Step number 2 is increasing the image size to the target resolution. Step number 3 is auto-aligning the 16 layers. Step number 4 is giving each of these layers the same equally distributed contribution to the final image via opacity. Step number 5 is flattening the 16 layers into one layer and exporting the JPEG. Let's start with step number 1, loading the 16 frames into a stack. So let's go in Photoshop to File. Let's go to Scripts. Under Scripts, let's go to Load Files into Stack. Then we browse for the 16 frames from the Multishot series. I have them in the dedicated folder here. Let's check them all. So then we are good here. We have marked all 16 frames. Let's go to Open. And then here make sure in the dialog that nothing is checkboxed here at the lower left hand side corner. Just click OK and Photoshop will create 16 layers and each frame will be in a dedicated layer. The process should go fairly well if you have a fast computer. If your computer is not one of the fastest ones you can get on planet Earth, you will need some patience here, but once in a while the process is done. And we see now here we have 16 frames in 16 layers. Step number 2 is going in image size, which is here image and then image size to the target resolution. And I looked up the final resolution of the multi-shot image we already looked at in Lightroom, and we need to go here on the width to 18,870 pixels, and then on the height we have automatically 10,614 pixels, and that's all we need to do here. On resample I typically go to Preserve Details 2.0. That is a good choice, works well for me, and then we click OK. So now it will go through all these layers here and will adjust the image size to the target resolution, which again, if you have not the fastest computer you can get, will take a while. On my computer, because it's very fast, this all goes processed very quickly. And you see here it enlarged the image now, and this actually applied to each and every layer. Let's zoom out a little bit here. If I choose a different layer here, it's the same image size no matter where I go. Then step number 2 is completed. Step number 3 is auto-aligning the 16 layers. So let's pick the first one here. Let's press and hold Shift. Let's go down to the last one. Let's also select this one. And then you see here 16 layers are selected now. Then let's go to Edit. And in Edit, let's go to Auto-Align Layers. So we choose that. And we don't click anything else here. We just go for Auto. That's fine. Go to OK. And then another process kicks in, which again, depending on the speed of your computer, will take a while or will go fairly quickly. Here you see a progress bar and it says align selected layers based on content. And even on my computer, this will take very likely a couple of minutes. The auto alignment process is now completed by Photoshop, and we come to step number 4. And if you look at the 16 layers and you focus here on opacity, they all have an opacity of 100%. So if we later flatten these 16 layers into one layer, in step number 5, we'll not gain anything because it will be dominated by one frame. Now, if we divide 1 by 16 frames, we end up at 6.25%. That means we give layer 1 now an opacity of 6%. We give layer 2 an opacity of 12%, which is 2 times 6%. We give layer number 3 an opacity of 18%. We give layer number 4 an opacity of 24%, and so on. And I will complete that process quickly, and then we come back for step number 5. I've completed that manual process now, and if we look again into the layers and their opacity, we have on layer 1 6%, layer 2 12, then 18, then 24, 30, we have 36, we have 42, we have 48, and so on. The second last layer has here 90%, and the last layer gets a bit more weight instead of 6%, 10%, because opacity cannot deal with fractions, so we always have to fill in rounded numbers here. So that's all completed, looks really good, and now we come to the last step, and that's step number 5. So we pick the first layer, we press and hold Shift and pick the last layer, and then we right click these marked layers, all 16 of them, and choose flatten image, and that's what is here in the menu. Let's do this. Now Photoshop is again processing this, and now we have one layer, and all we need to do now is going to File, Export, and here I have Quick Export as JPEG. Let's do this. Let's store it, let's say on the desktop. Let's give it a name. Let's say Photoshop Multishot, and let's store it on the desktop, and then let's look into the image in Lightroom. That completes the process, so 5 steps as outlined. What I will do now is I will automate this with an action, because I have another series of 16 frames from a shooting in Singapore, which I want to process in the same way, and it's tedious to do this by hand. I can just record the action, store it under my folder Math Photographer here, and in this way automate the complete process. I can lean back and wait until Photoshop gets the stacking of the images done in the way I just demonstrated. I'm now back in Lightroom here, and on the left hand side we have the multi-shot image with high resolution coming from Sony's Image Edge software, where I was not happy with the sharpness. If I cropped in by 100%, it seemed to be a little bit blurry, and on the right hand side I have the multi-shot coming from my manual procedure with the 16 frames coming from the Sony A7R V, but done manually in Photoshop. And if we look at that and crop in, now the blurriness is gone. On the right hand side, this building here is sharp and crisp. Also the highlights are a bit better controlled, because I had the opportunity to post-process with Lightroom these 16 frames before I started the stacking process. On the left hand side, the building is a little bit blurry. It doesn't look badly in any way, but it's just blurry. It's not as good as it should be. Same here on the church tower, and by the way, here you also see on the left hand side coming from Imaging Edge, we have some aberrations here in the tower. That's not the case in my outcome from the manual procedure, and again the right hand side is crisp and sharp, and the left hand side is a little bit blurry. On the highlight side, the same story. Highlights are just better controlled in my manual procedure via Photoshop on the right hand side than what Imaging Edge brought out on the left hand side. And then if we look here again into details, let's go here to this building. Again, if you look at that, the right hand side is much better. If you look at the clock here, highlights are better controlled on the right hand side, and in general this is just a much better outcome, and most importantly it's no longer blurry when you crop in by 100%. Here now I'm back in Imaging Edge from Sony and actually processing 16 frames from a multi-shot shooting in Singapore. So the hotel here is the Marina Bay, a very famous hotel, has also laser shows in the evening, is very spectacular actually. And I process them via Imaging Edge, and then I'm going to do the same procedure in Photoshop, which I showed before, with my own manual procedure, but it will not be manual this time because by now I recorded an action, so I just have to push a button and Photoshop will go through all these steps 2, 3, 4 and 5 automatically, and I can just lean back and wait for the result. Now let's do the stacking with my procedure in Photoshop here. And all I have to do is I have to load these 16 frames from the Marina Bay Hotel in Singapore into a stack. The rest is automated now by an action in Photoshop. So let's go here. Let's browse. Here are the frames. So let's select them, 16 Singapore frames. Let's select them all and let's load them into the stack. Let's go to OK here. And you've seen this before, of course. So this now creates 16 layers. The 16 frames are placed in these layers, each frame in one dedicated layer. And that process should be completed in a second. Here we go. Let's get the Nick Google Suite away here. And now I have an action here. And that action is under my folder Math Photographer, and it's called, that's the name I gave it, 16 times multi-shot stacking. And it has all the steps here which I manually proceeded before. Now I select this and I go on play here, and then this will all happen automatically. There's nothing I have to do. You see the image size is adjusted. This will continue now for a while, and I can just lean back and relax, and that process, which is stored under the action 16 times multi-shot stacking, will get everything done for me. So there's nothing I need to do. Here you see aligning, auto aligning. This is all happening fully automated now. Again, I'm back in Lightroom. On the left hand side is the multi-shot as it came out of Imaging Edge from Sony. And on the right hand side we have the multi-shot where these 16 frames are stacked together with that Photoshop procedure I showed before, this time fully automated. And this time I think the multi-shot software from Sony did a very good job, because if we crop in here, this looks really good on both sides. And there are lots of details. The noise is very well controlled in these images. I think the highlights are still a bit better on the right hand side, but in general it is a really good and very comparable image. Here again you see it on the highlights, but that's something you might even be able to control in post a little better. And by the way, I have applied the same post-processing procedure here in Lightroom to actually make the image brighter and, you know, get a bit more light into the shadows and so on. So they are both processed in kind of the same way. It's also very well controlled in terms of noise. If we crop in here, this looks good on both sides, and the level of detail, the sharpness we get here out of these images, I just want to go here, because if you look carefully, you see here actually people standing on the ceiling on both images, and in most of the times, 90% I would say, when I use the multi-shot option on the Sony A7R V, it actually works when I post-process this later with Imaging Edge from Sony. And that is different to former Sony Alpha cameras, because it was always a nightmare to do multi-shots. On the Sony A7R V, and I think also on the Sony Alpha 1, it works pretty reasonable and actually produces in general good results. But if it is not working, as we saw before on this Zurich image, then you can still use the 16 frames, because they will be fine. The 16 frames also on the Zurich image before were crisp and sharp, but for the post-processing and stacking it together, use my procedure in Photoshop to get a very nice outcome, as you can also see here. And then you don't rely on the Sony software only. You can try first with Imaging Edge. If it is working, fine. If it is not working, then go to the manual procedure or create that action in Photoshop, which gets the job done for you. At the end of the video, I want to show another multi-shot, 16 frames, Sony A7R V, shot at 1.6 seconds at f8.0, base ISO 50, and a resolution of 19,008 times 12,672 pixels. And here Sony's Imaging Edge did a terrific job. This image was shot early in the blue hour, and the result is just breathtaking in terms of details, sharpness and crispness. No mistakes from the software. Here you see no noise in the sky. If we look into that, crop in by 100%, absolutely brilliant, super crisp, and in details hardly to beat. A really good image. By the way, if you look in here, you can even look into the shopping windows here. Of course, based on a 1.6 second exposure, motion blurriness on people walking through the city, but that's all fine. Also, if you look here, super crisp and super sharp, nothing to complain. And I'm showing this image intentionally, of course, in order to show you there are only a few cases where the multi-shot software, Imaging Edge from Sony, didn't work for me. In, I would say, 90% or even more of the cases, and I took a lot of shots with the Sony A7R V in the last weeks, it actually worked. But in the very special occasions when it doesn't work, as in my first example in this video, go for the manual procedure or create an action in Photoshop and do it yourself when you stack the images. Then you don't have to rely on Imaging Edge from Sony, you're just independent. But this image here is really, really good and really crisp. Look at the details here. Everything is there, everything I wanted. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.